Betrayal doesn't always arrive with shouting or violence. Sometimes it comes quietly, handed to you in a small box by a waiter who won't meet your eyes. The waiter stopped beside my table just as I lifted my glass. He didn't smile. He didn't explain. He placed a small, plain box next to my plate and leaned in just enough to whisper, "You will need this tonight." Then he walked away. I didn't open it right away. People think moments of betrayal explode into your life. They imagine yelling, fists, slammed doors. But real betrayal is calm. It sits beside you. It waits. I was in a restaurant I had visited 100 times before. White tablecloths. Low music. Soft voices from nearby tables. Across from me sat the people who had taken everything from me, without ever touching a thing. They laughed. They talked about the future. They raised their glasses. And I sat there, holding my breath, staring at a box I already knew I shouldn't open. Because something deep inside me had already gone cold. I slowly lifted the lid. Inside was a key, a single photograph, and a folded note. The photograph showed a door I recognized instantly. My door. The note had only 6 words written in clean, careful handwriting. You deserve to know the truth. In that moment, the noise of the restaurant faded. I could still see everyone smiling, talking, living, but it felt like I had stepped outside of time. I didn't react. I didn't speak. I simply placed the items back into the box and closed it. Because men who survive betrayal don't expose their shock. They observe. And I had just realized something important. The evening wasn't about celebration. It was about confession. This story didn't begin in that restaurant. It began months earlier, long before the box, the key, or the waiter. Back when I still believed loyalty was mutual. Back when I thought respect, once earned, could not be quietly stolen. I had spent years building a calm life. Not flashy. Not loud. A steady career. A modest home in a quiet neighborhood. Relationships built on consistency, not drama. People trusted me because I never needed attention. I listened more than I spoke. And that, I later learned, made me invisible. In my workplace, I was the reliable one. The man who fixed problems without asking for credit. The man who stayed late when others left early. The man whose ideas were used, without his name attached. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't ambitious. I wasn't chasing titles. I wanted peace. What I didn't realize was that peace can make predators comfortable. They mistake silence for weakness. They mistake patience for ignorance. And they mistake kindness for permission. The shift was subtle. Meetings I used to attend suddenly happened without me. Decisions I used to help shape were already made. People stopped asking for my input, but still used my work. When I noticed, I didn't confront anyone. I watched. Because confrontation reveals emotion. Observation reveals truth. I started noticing looks exchanged across conference tables. Pauses when I entered a room. Emails sent late at night, never copied to me. And then came the invitations. Dinner. Celebrations. Private gatherings. I was included just enough to stay unaware. Just enough to stay useful. Until one evening, an invitation arrived that felt deliberate. A dinner to celebrate a new direction. A toast to teamwork. A chance to finally be acknowledged. I almost didn't go, but something told me I should. Not curiosity. Instinct. That instinct led me to the restaurant. To the waiter. To the box. And to the realization that betrayal doesn't want your anger. It wants your confusion. When I returned home that night, I didn't sleep. I placed the box on my kitchen table and sat across from it until morning. I examined the key first. It wasn't for my house. It was smaller. Older. The kind used for storage units. Or private offices. The photograph showed my front door, but taken from across the street. Recent. Someone had been watching. The note didn't accuse. It didn't threaten. It simply offered truth. That was the most dangerous part. People who want revenge make noise. People who want justice stay quiet. I didn't panic. I didn't call anyone. I brewed coffee and waited for daylight. Because whatever was coming, it was already in motion. And I needed to understand who had set it in motion, and why. Later that week, the changes became clearer. Responsibilities I had carried for years were reassigned. My access to systems was reduced. My role was being erased, slowly, carefully. No argument, no warning, just a quiet removal. They were preparing to replace me, and they believed I wouldn't resist. They were right about one thing. I wouldn't resist. I would outlast. Because revenge doesn't require speed. It requires patience. And I had learned how to wait. That waiter didn't give me a weapon. He gave me awareness. And awareness is far more dangerous. By the time the truth fully revealed itself, I was no longer afraid. I was calm, focused, ready. Because when betrayal thinks it has already won, that's when it makes mistakes. Injustice becomes unmistakable the moment you realize the people smiling at you are quietly arranging your exit. The next morning, I walked into work like nothing had changed. That was important. Men who reveal suspicion too early lose control of the story. I nodded. I greeted people by name. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. And immediately, I noticed what was missing. Files I had worked on for months were no longer accessible. Shared folders were locked. Permissions quietly revoked. No announcement. No explanation. Just absence. I didn't ask questions. Instead, I paid attention. Around mid-morning, a meeting invitation appeared on my screen, one I hadn't been included in. I knew because the calendar room was booked. I could see the time. I could see who accepted. I wasn't on the list. That meeting used to be mine. I leaned back in my chair and watched people walk past my desk toward the conference room. They avoided eye contact. Not out of guilt. Out of discomfort. People don't like standing near someone they believe is already gone. That was when I understood something critical. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a plan. And plans leave trails. At lunch, I stepped outside and sat alone on a bench across the street. I watched the building through the glass windows. I noticed who spoke to whom, who laughed freely, who checked over their shoulder. There was a pattern forming. Certain people had grown confident, others cautious. Confidence comes from protection. Caution comes from knowledge. And knowledge, I was beginning to see, had been shared selectively. That evening, I returned home and opened the box again. I studied the photograph more closely. The angle. The timing. It wasn't taken by a stranger. It was taken by someone patient. Someone who knew my routine. Someone who wanted me to see it. The key remained the mystery. I turned it over in my fingers and felt the weight of intention behind it. Keys don't accuse. They invite. Over the next few days, I said less and listened more. That's when people reveal themselves. Casual comments slipped out. Statements half-finished. Conversations that stopped when I entered. I heard phrases like, "He doesn't need to know yet. Let's wait until everything is finalized. He won't fight it." Fight what? No one had told me anything. But they were already predicting my response. That told me everything. One afternoon, someone I trusted sat across from me during a coffee break. Their voice was gentle. Too gentle. "You seem quiet lately," they said. I smiled. "I'm always quiet." They nodded, relieved. Because silence reassures liars. It allows them to believe their story is still intact. That night, I finally used the key. The address had been tucked into the box, handwritten, almost like an afterthought. A storage facility on the edge of town. Anonymous. Unremarkable. I arrived just before closing. The clerk barely looked up. Unit number matched the tag on the key. Inside was a single filing cabinet. No boxes. No clutter. Just documents. Printed emails. Contracts. Meeting notes. All involving my work. All stripped of my name. Ideas I had built were being reassigned. Decisions I had influenced were being rewritten. And at the center of it all was a quiet agreement, one that made my role unnecessary. They weren't firing me for failure. They were erasing me for convenience. I stood there for a long time. Not angry. Not shocked. Just clear. Because clarity is the moment when fear leaves. They believed I was passive. They believed I would accept what was coming. They believed silence meant surrender. They were wrong. I returned the documents exactly as I found them. That was important. Revenge is not about disrupting the plan. It's about allowing the plan to complete itself, while changing who benefits. Back at work, the tone shifted further. Smiles became rehearsed. Praise became distant. Responsibility faded. I was being prepared for departure. But something else was happening too. They were becoming careless. When people think victory is guaranteed, they stop hiding. Emails became bolder. Language became confident. They spoke as if I was already a memory. That arrogance would cost them. Because I was no longer guessing. I was documenting. Every interaction. Every shift. Every contradiction. I didn't need allies. I needed time. And time, quietly, was on my side. One evening, another invitation arrived. Another dinner. Another celebration. Same restaurant. Same people. Different purpose. This time, I understood. This wasn't about honoring teamwork. It was about watching me disappear gracefully. About proving to themselves that they were still good people. That I was leaving willingly. I accepted the invitation. Because there is power in showing up. And even more power in being underestimated. That night would matter. Because by then, the truth would no longer be contained in a box. It would be standing at the table with us. Waiting. Danger becomes real the instant you realize the trap was designed not to destroy you, but to make you disappear without a trace. The night of the dinner arrived quietly. No rain. No drama. Just another ordinary evening. Exactly how they wanted it. I dressed the same way I always did. Nothing new. Nothing noticeable. Men who plan to endure don't change their appearance. They change their awareness. At the restaurant, the table was already set. Glasses aligned. Candles lit. Seats arranged with intention. My place was slightly off-center. Not forgotten. Adjusted. They greeted me warmly. Too warmly. Compliments came easily. Laughter lingered longer than usual. This was a performance. And like all performances, it depended on timing. I listened. I smiled. I said very little. The box from the waiter sat in my coat pocket, not as evidence, but as a reminder. I didn't need proof anymore. I needed confirmation. Midway through dinner, the conversation shifted. Subtle. They began speaking about the future. About streamlining. About moving forward. All words that sound positive when you don't include names. One of them raised a glass. To loyalty, they said. I noticed who avoided my eyes. I noticed who watched my reaction carefully. I raised my glass too. To clarity, I replied. No one questioned it. They wouldn't have understood. Then the waiter returned. Same man. Same careful distance. He placed the check on the table. And with it, another folded note. This one addressed to me. No name. Just intent. I didn't open it there. I waited. Because truth, revealed too early, loses its impact. After dinner, as we stood outside saying our rehearsed goodbyes, one of them put a hand on my shoulder. You've been quiet, they said softly. I smiled. I've been listening. They laughed. Nervously. At home, I opened the note. It read, "They plan to announce it tomorrow morning." No signature. No emotion. Just information. That was enough. I slept peacefully that night. Not because I felt safe, but because uncertainty had ended. Morning arrived on schedule. So did the announcement. A meeting invitation appeared on my calendar. Mandatory. Brief. Final. I walked in with the same calm I had practiced all my life. They spoke carefully. Kindly. They praised my dedication. My contributions. Then they explained the restructuring. My role was no longer required. They offered a package. A handshake. A narrative. I accepted all of it. Without resistance. Without questions. Because resistance was never the plan. They believed they had succeeded. They believed the story would end there. What they didn't realize was that silence is not agreement. It is preparation. I left the building carrying a box of personal items. They watched from the windows. Relieved. Satisfied. I didn't look back. Not because I was hurt, but because I was already moving forward. That afternoon, I visited a lawyer. Not to fight. To understand. Understanding is leverage. That evening, I returned to the storage unit one last time. I took copies. Not everything. Just enough. Because justice doesn't need excess. It needs precision. Weeks passed. I stayed quiet. No social media posts. No complaints. No explanations. They relaxed. And then, slowly, the consequences arrived. Contracts questioned. Processes audited. Decisions reviewed. Not by me. By systems larger than them. The kind that don't care about personal alliances. The kind that follow documentation. They never suspected my involvement. Because I never appeared involved. That was the point. Months later, I received an invitation. Not from them. From someone above them. A request for context. For clarification. For truth. I provided it. Calmly. Factually. Without accusation. And when the dust settled, the outcomes were quiet. Positions changed. Reputations shifted. Careers stalled. No public collapse. No dramatic apologies. Just correction. And accountability. I didn't celebrate. I didn't announce victory. I moved on. Because the real revenge wasn't what they lost. It was what I gained. Peace. Perspective. And the knowledge that when betrayal comes softly, so does justice. Betrayal cuts deepest when it grows inside the life you believed was already safe. Before everything collapsed, my life looked ordinary. That is why the betrayal worked. Ordinary lives don't expect ambushes. I lived in a quiet neighborhood where people waved but didn't ask questions. The kind of place where routines mattered more than surprises. Every morning followed the same rhythm. Coffee. A short drive. The same streets. Consistency builds comfort. Comfort builds trust. And trust, I learned, can be borrowed by the wrong people. At work, I wasn't ambitious in the way others were. I didn't chase promotions. I didn't compete for attention. I believed steady effort spoke louder than self-promotion. That belief made me valuable. It also made me exploitable. People came to me when something was broken. They left when it worked again. I never complained. Not because I didn't notice, but because I believed character would eventually matter. That was my mistake. Character matters only when someone is watching. Behind closed doors, different rules applied. The workplace was polite on the surface. Underneath, it was strategic. Alliances shifted quietly. Power moved without announcements. And loyalty was measured by usefulness, not history. I didn't grow up learning how to navigate that world. I learned to be dependable. I learned to keep my word. I learned to solve problems without demanding recognition. Those lessons made me good at my job. They did not protect me from being removed from it. Outside of work, my life was calm. Evenings were quiet. Weekends were predictable. I kept my circle small, not out of isolation, out of preference. Too many voices create confusion. I valued clarity. That clarity made the betrayal sharper. Because when you simplify your life, every disruption stands out. The first signs weren't dramatic. They were emotional absences. Messages that went unanswered. Plans postponed. Conversations shortened. People I had supported for years began treating me like a temporary presence, as if my time was already limited. I noticed. I just didn't respond, because I had learned something early in life. When people begin distancing themselves, they're not confused. They're rehearsing goodbye. The man who would later shake my hand during my exit once asked me for advice. He sat in my office, anxious, unsure. I gave him guidance without hesitation. He thanked me. He never mentioned that conversation again. I don't think about him with anger. I think about him with clarity. He did what people do when opportunity outweighs loyalty. He chose himself. I don't judge him for that. I judge him for pretending otherwise. That is the true offense. Not ambition. Deception. The restaurant where everything began wasn't special. That's why it mattered. Betrayal doesn't choose dramatic settings. It chooses familiar ones. Places where you feel relaxed. Places where defenses are down. The waiter wasn't part of their plan. That much became clear later. He was part of someone else's conscience. Someone who couldn't stay silent. That mattered too. Because not everyone involved in injustice agrees with it. Some people simply lack the courage to stop it directly. So they leave signs. Small ones. I respected that. In the weeks after my departure, I didn't isolate. I observed. I spoke to people who had no stake in my downfall. People who didn't benefit from my absence. They told me what I already suspected. My work hadn't disappeared. My name had. Credit had been reassigned. Narratives rewritten. It wasn't personal. It was procedural. That made it worse. Because systems don't feel guilt. They only respond to exposure. I didn't seek revenge. I sought balance. Revenge is emotional. Balance is structural. And structures respond to patience. I spent time understanding how things truly functioned. Not how they were presented. Who signed what? Who approved what? Who benefited from what? Knowledge became my anchor. Not obsession. Orientation. I wasn't planning to return. I was planning to move forward without illusion. And in that process, something unexpected happened. I felt lighter. Because when a life built on routine collapses, it forces you to decide what actually mattered. I discovered I didn't miss the position. I missed the assumption of fairness. Once that assumption was gone, I was free. The setup for betrayal always begins with comfort, with trust, with routine. That's what makes it effective. That's also what makes it detectable, if you're paying attention. I had been paying attention, just not soon enough. Injustice feels inevitable the moment you realize the people closest to you learn to smile while planning your removal. After I left that building for the last time, people assumed I disappeared. That was comforting for them. When someone vanishes quietly, it allows others to rewrite the ending. They told themselves I had accepted it. That I was relieved. That I had moved on without questions. They needed that version of me to sleep well. I allowed them to keep it. In truth, my days became more intentional. I woke without urgency. No alarm demanding obedience. No calendar filled by other people's priorities. For the first time in years, I could think without interruption. And thinking, when done honestly, changes a man. I reviewed my past without bitterness. I didn't replay arguments. I replayed moments. The small ones. The pauses. The hesitations. I began to recognize when the shift truly started. It wasn't when they excluded me. It was when they stopped needing my approval. That's when respect quietly ended. Respect requires acknowledgement. Once people believe they can proceed without it, loyalty becomes unnecessary. A former colleague reached out a few weeks later. Not to check on me. To confirm something. They wanted reassurance that I wasn't upset. That word again. Upset. As if injustice is an emotion rather than a fact. "I'm fine," I said. And I meant it. Because anger would have kept me connected to them. I didn't want that. They relaxed immediately. People relax when they believe consequences are unlikely. That relaxation makes them careless. Carelessness reveals truth. Over time, more messages came. Small updates. Unintentional confessions. People talk when they think you're harmless. I listened. I never corrected them. Correction implies involvement. Distance implies disinterest. And disinterest disarms. I spent time reconnecting with myself. Long walks. Quiet meals. Books I had postponed. The silence wasn't empty. It was instructive. It taught me something valuable. I had confused stability with security. Stability can be taken. Security must be built internally. Once I accepted that, the past lost its power over me. What remained was understanding. And understanding creates choices. One afternoon, I met someone who used to work in a different department. We hadn't spoken in years. They didn't owe me anything. That made the conversation honest. They spoke carefully at first. Then more freely. They confirmed what I already knew. My removal had been discussed long before I sensed it. Months. My silence had been interpreted as consent. My reliability as predictability. They didn't hate me. They simply didn't fear consequences. That is the environment where betrayal thrives. I thanked them. Not for the information. For the clarity. Clarity dissolves resentment. It replaces it with direction. I wasn't angry at individuals anymore. I was aware of systems. And systems can be navigated. Not emotionally. Strategically. The restaurant, the box, the key, they weren't the beginning. They were the signal. The moment someone decided I deserved to know. That decision mattered. Because it meant even within betrayal, conscience existed. That realization changed my approach. This wasn't about punishment. It was about alignment. About restoring balance without becoming what I despised. I began rebuilding. Not loudly. Not publicly. Quietly. I updated my skills. I expanded my network. Not with desperation. With selectivity. I chose people who listened. People who valued substance over performance. Slowly, opportunities emerged. Not because I chased them. Because I was prepared. Preparedness is the calmest form of power. What surprised me most wasn't how quickly others moved on. It was how quickly I did. Once you accept that injustice is not personal, it loses its grip. What remains is choice. And choice, when exercised patiently, becomes freedom. This part of the story matters. Because revenge didn't begin with action. It began with restraint. With understanding who I was before betrayal, and who I refused to become after it. Betrayal becomes irreversible the moment you understand it was never a mistake, only a decision made without your consent. There is a strange clarity that comes after loss. Not immediately. At first, the mind looks for errors. Things you could have said. Meetings you could have handled differently. But eventually, that noise fades. What remains is truth. And the truth was simple. They didn't misunderstand me. They didn't overlook me. They chose a version of the future where I wasn't necessary. Once I accepted that, the past stopped demanding explanations. I stopped asking why. I started asking how. How systems allow quiet injustice. How silence is interpreted as weakness. How good work, without visibility, becomes invisible. These questions didn't haunt me. They educated me. I began to see patterns I had missed before. People who rise quickly often do so by standing on something steady. They rarely build that stability themselves. They borrow it, use it, then remove it when it no longer serves them. I had been that stability. Reliable, unquestioning, present. I had confused being needed with being respected. Respect requires leverage. I had none, because I never thought I needed it. That realization didn't make me bitter. It made me precise. In quiet moments, I thought about the people involved. Not with anger, with distance. Each one played a role. Some acted. Some stayed silent. Some benefited without asking questions. Silence, I learned, is not neutral. It leans toward convenience. That lesson stayed with me. I revisited the storage unit one final time. Not for documents. For closure. I stood inside that small space and understood something important. Evidence is not power. Timing is. Revealing truth too early makes you emotional. Revealing it too late makes it irrelevant. The right moment is when truth aligns with consequence. That moment hadn't arrived yet, and forcing it would cheapen it. So I walked away. Certain. Prepared. As weeks turned into months, my absence reshaped their environment. Work that once flowed easily slowed. Decisions required more discussion. Mistakes appeared where structure used to exist. They compensated by working harder, by controlling tighter, by trusting less. That kind of tension creates fractures. Not immediately, but inevitably. I didn't need to be there. My absence was already speaking. I received updates indirectly. Projects delayed. Clients unsettled. Internal reviews initiated. Nothing dramatic. Just enough pressure to expose weakness. Pressure doesn't create character. It reveals it. During this time, I built something new. Not a replacement. A redefinition. I accepted consulting work selectively. Short term. High trust. Clear boundaries. No illusions. No silent sacrifices. For the first time, my value was acknowledged openly. Not because I demanded it. Because I required clarity. That requirement changed everything. The final piece of the setup wasn't professional. It was internal. I forgave myself. Not for failing. For believing fairness was automatic. It isn't. Fairness must be reinforced. Protected. Sometimes quietly. Sometimes strategically. Once I let go of guilt, I became lighter. And lighter men move faster, even when they appear still. By the end of that year, the stage was set. Not for confrontation. For consequence. Everything that needed to happen was already moving. I didn't push. I didn't interfere. I allowed gravity to work. Because systems built on quiet injustice eventually collapse under their own weight. All you have to do is step out of the way. The first signs appeared quietly. That is always how decline begins. Not with failure, but with friction. Requests that used to be simple became complicated. Decisions that once took minutes now stretched into meetings. I heard about it through people who didn't intend to report back. They spoke casually, unconcerned. But the details told a different story. Processes were slowing. Quality checks were failing. Clients were asking questions that hadn't been asked before. Not accusations. Clarifications. And clarifications make people nervous. Because they expose gaps. I remained distant. Not unreachable. Just unavailable. That distinction matters. Unreachable invites speculation. Unavailable establishes boundaries. People respect boundaries more than absence. Occasionally, I received messages. Carefully worded. Non-committal. How are you? Hope you're doing well. No apologies. No acknowledgments. Just attempts to test proximity. I responded politely, briefly, never with details. Information is currency. I wasn't spending it. Meanwhile, inside the organization, pressure increased. New leadership expectations. External audits. Performance reviews that demanded justification. Not personal. Structural. The kind of pressure that doesn't accuse, but requires evidence. Evidence they lacked. I knew because I had once provided it. Silently. Consistently. Without fanfare. Now that silence echoed. One afternoon, I met someone for coffee. They had stayed behind. Not by choice. By necessity. They were tired. Careful. They spoke as if the walls were listening. Things are tense, they said. I nodded. Not because I wanted details. Because acknowledgement invites continuation. They're realizing how much you held together, they added. I didn't respond. Credit wasn't my goal. Recognition changes nothing. Accountability does. I had learned something important during this phase. When systems start failing, people look for causes. They rarely look inward. They search for missing pieces. I was that missing piece. But admitting that would require admitting error. And error threatens identity. So they avoided it. Instead, they doubled down. More control. More oversight. More pressure. That response always accelerates collapse. The rising conflict wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No emergency meetings. Just tension. Like a structure under too much weight. Small cracks. Unnoticed until they spread. I continued my work elsewhere. Focused. Unrushed. I built relationships that valued transparency. I chose environments where silence wasn't mistaken for consent. That contrast sharpened my perspective. I realized how unhealthy my former situation had been. Not hostile. Just quietly exploitative. At some point, someone above them began asking questions. Not accusations. Patterns. Why timelines shifted. Why costs increased. Why turnover rose. Those questions didn't need answers immediately. They needed consistency. Consistency they no longer had. Because the person who maintained it had been removed. Quietly. Efficiently. Irreversibly. I didn't intervene. I didn't submit complaints. I didn't seek validation. I allowed the story to unfold. Because conflict, when allowed to mature, reveals its own resolution. People assume revenge requires action. It doesn't. It requires restraint. One evening, I received a message from an unfamiliar number. Short. Direct. Can we talk? No context. No greeting. I waited. Then replied. About what? There was a pause. Then, we may have made a mistake. Mistakes acknowledged too late become consequences. I didn't rush. Urgency belongs to those losing control, not those who already let go. The rising conflict had reached its midpoint. They were aware something was wrong. They just didn't know where it had started. That uncertainty was more uncomfortable than blame. Because you can fight blame. You can't fight absence. Tension turns dangerous when the people who betrayed you begin searching for a way back. I didn't respond to the message right away. That was intentional. Speed communicates need. Silence communicates control. By the time I replied, the tone had already shifted. From confidence to concern. We agreed to meet in a neutral place. Not the restaurant. Not the office. Somewhere ordinary. Because ordinary places expose extraordinary discomfort. They arrived early. That alone told me everything. People who once made you wait don't arrive early unless the balance has changed. They spoke carefully. Too carefully. Phrases were tested before being released. Regret hovered, but never landed. Not yet. They didn't apologize. They explained. Explanation is not accountability. It's rehearsal. I listened. I asked no questions. Questions give direction. I wanted them uncertain. They spoke about pressure, about expectations, about difficult decisions. I nodded, not in agreement, in acknowledgement. Then they asked if I would consider helping, consulting, temporarily, quietly. No public acknowledgement, no reversal of narrative, just function. I understood the offer. They wanted the structure back without admitting who built it. I declined. Not angrily, not dramatically. Simply, I'm not available. They tried again. Different wording. Same intent. I repeated myself. Availability is not about time. It's about trust. Trust had already been spent. After that meeting, things escalated. Faster audits. Stricter reviews. More oversight. Stress revealed cracks in relationships. People turned on each other. Responsibility shifted. Blame circulated. The calm confidence I once observed had vanished. In its place was urgency. Urgency leads to mistakes. Mistakes leave records. Records create trails. I was contacted again, this time by someone higher. Polite, formal, interested. They wanted context, not an accusation, an opportunity. I provided information, not opinion, facts, dates, documents, nothing emotional, nothing speculative. Truth doesn't need emphasis. It only needs accuracy. The response was subtle. Projects paused. Approvals delayed. Reviews expanded. The machine had noticed friction. And machines respond methodically. Inside the organization, the atmosphere shifted. Fear replaced arrogance. Caution replaced confidence. People who once felt untouchable became careful with their words. Carefulness is the beginning of accountability. I remained uninvolved publicly. That was crucial. If they could blame me, they would. If they could accuse me of revenge, they would. So I stayed absent, unprovocative, letting systems do what systems do. Another message arrived. Longer this time. More personal. They admitted they underestimated the impact of my departure. That word again. Impact. Not harm. Not wrongdoing. Impact is a neutral term. It avoids responsibility. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't care. Because the moment didn't require it. The rising conflict had reached a point of no return. The story was no longer about me. It was about structure. About decisions made quietly and defended poorly. About systems that fail when built on convenience. I had simply stepped aside. They had done the rest. What people rarely understand is this. Revenge that announces itself invites resistance. Revenge that hides inside consequence invites acceptance. By the time they recognize the outcome, it was already normalized. And normalization is irreversible. The moment of danger arrives when denial stops working and the truth can no longer be delayed. The change didn't happen all at once. It never does. It arrived in fragments. A postponed decision here. A cancelled project there. A review that should have been routine, but wasn't. From the outside, everything still looked intact. Inside, the structure was bending. People began protecting themselves. That was the clearest sign. When loyalty turns inward, collapse is close. Meetings became shorter. Emails became longer. Language became cautious. Everyone was documenting. Documentation is fear in formal clothing. I learned through quiet channels that leadership had split. Not openly. Privately. Disagreements over direction. Over responsibility. Over who approved what. I didn't need to influence this. Confusion, once introduced, multiplies. Because clarity requires trust. And trust had already been compromised. One evening, I received an unexpected call. No introduction. Just a question. Did you know this would happen? I paused. Then answered honestly. I knew it was possible. Possibility is enough. You don't need certainty to prepare. They asked why I hadn't warned anyone. I replied calmly. No one asked. Silence, once again, was interpreted incorrectly. The internal review expanded. Scope widened. Time frames extended. What began as a procedural check became an examination of decision-making. Not intent. Patterns. Patterns tell stories people didn't know they were writing. Meanwhile, I stayed grounded. Routine returned to my life, but on my terms. Work that respected boundaries. Time that belonged to me. The contrast was sharp. I realized how much tension I had been carrying without noticing. Freedom doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives with ease. Eventually, a formal request came. Not an invitation. A request. For testimony. For context. For recollection. I agreed. Not out of spite. Out of principle. Principles don't demand revenge. They require truth. I spoke clearly. Slowly. Without emotion. I described my role. My responsibilities. The changes. The removals. I didn't assign motives. I didn't speculate. I let timelines speak. Silence followed. That silence mattered. Because it wasn't confusion. It was recognition. After that, the outcomes were inevitable. Resignations framed as transitions. Reassignments labeled as strategic shifts. Language softened. Reality didn't. The people who once controlled the narrative lost control of the process. Processes don't care about hierarchy. They care about sequence. And the sequence had been recorded. I wasn't informed of every consequence. I didn't need to be. Justice doesn't require front-row seats. It requires alignment. And alignment had occurred. The rising conflict ended not with confrontation, but with exposure. And exposure, when unchallenged, becomes resolution. The real turning point arrives when you realize you no longer need to act, because the truth has already started moving on its own. By the time I was asked to formally speak, something inside me had shifted. Not relief. Detachment. That mattered. Because men who act while detached don't seek validation. They seek accuracy. I prepared carefully. Not for defense. For precision. Dates. Documents. Sequences. I organized everything the way I always had, quietly, methodically. The same skills that once made me replaceable were now making me undeniable. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt responsibility. Because once truth enters a system, it doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to consequence. The meeting wasn't dramatic. No raised voices. No accusations. Just a long table. Neutral expressions. Measured questions. I answered only what was asked. Nothing more. Nothing less. Over-explaining weakens credibility. Silence between answers creates space for thought. I allowed that space. They asked how I felt during my removal. I paused. Then answered honestly. I felt unnecessary. The room shifted. Not emotionally. Structurally. Because unnecessary people don't get removed. Assets do. And assets leave records. I was asked if I believed the actions were intentional. I said, I believe they were convenient. Convenience is a powerful word. It removes emotion. It assigns responsibility without accusation. They wrote it down. When the meeting ended, I didn't wait for feedback. I didn't ask what would happen next. Those questions belonged to a past version of me. I left calmly, knowing I had said exactly what needed to be said. No more. No less. Outside, the world moved normally. Cars passed. People walked. Life continued. That's when I understood something deeply. Justice rarely feels dramatic to the person who finally receives it. It feels quiet, like balance returning. In the weeks that followed, decisions were made. Not publicly, internally. Chains of authority adjusted. Responsibilities redistributed. Oversight increased. No announcements. No apologies. Just correction. Correction is the most honest form of accountability. I received a final message from someone involved. Short. Careful. We didn't think it would go this far. That sentence revealed everything. They thought consequences were negotiable. They thought silence meant consent. They were wrong. I didn't reply. Closure doesn't require dialogue. What mattered wasn't what they lost. It was what I gained. Clarity. Boundaries. Self-respect. The turning point wasn't when they fell. It was when I realized I had already moved beyond them. This was the moment revenge often reveals itself. But this story wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. Restoring balance. Restoring truth. Restoring myself. And restoration never needs an audience. Power shifts quietly when those who believe they controlled everything realize the foundation they depended on has vanished. In the weeks after the meeting, the subtle signs began to multiply. Decisions that had once sailed through now required scrutiny. Approvals took longer. Documents were double-checked. People started questioning each other instead of assuming authority. I didn't interfere. I didn't guide. I simply observed. Observation is far more effective than action when the system itself has started correcting. One by one, the small cracks grew. A department head missed a key deadline. A project manager misallocated resources. Emails were sent to the wrong people. Minor errors multiplied because no one was holding the framework together. And that framework, I had been it. The one who quietly fixed gaps. The one who ensured smooth execution. Once removed, the absence revealed its importance, not to me, but to everyone else. I received another message. Different sender. Tone anxious. We're realizing your contributions were significant. No apology. No recognition. Just acknowledgement of fact. Facts can't be argued with. They can't be spun. They simply exist. I didn't respond. Because the beauty of this moment is that it no longer needed me. The truth was unfolding on its own. The structures I had maintained were now self-correcting, albeit painfully for them. I watched the chain of minor failures cascade. Not to gloat, not to harm, but to witness clarity taking its course. The people who once smiled at my quiet compliance now fumbled under scrutiny. Some tried to regain control through micromanagement. Others attempted to hide mistakes. And a few, most dangerous of all, tried to shift blame onto each other. That internal tension is far more devastating than any confrontation. It erodes trust. It reveals character. It punishes without your hand ever touching it. During this time, I built a new routine. My work shifted. My relationships shifted. My energy focused on environments where trust and accountability were reciprocal. I became selective. I became deliberate. I became calm. And that calm, oddly enough, amplified the pressure elsewhere. Because when a system loses its stabilizing point, panic eventually replaces efficiency. I was contacted again by someone in leadership, not to apologize, not to compensate, but for clarity. They asked specific questions about timelines, approvals, and dependencies. I answered simply, factually, and without emotion. Nothing more. Nothing less. That was all it took. The consequences began to materialize quietly. Deadlines missed were corrected. Projects faltered temporarily. People who had counted on my absence struggled to maintain consistency. Internal reports were delayed. External clients noticed discrepancies. No one accused me. No one confronted me. The system had simply corrected itself, with a light I had once maintained now gone. By the end of the month, it was clear. They weren't failing because they were incompetent. They were failing because they had underestimated structure, discipline, and the invisible weight of reliability. And in that failure, there is a lesson. Systems cannot rely on silent contributions without acknowledgement. People cannot rely on the goodwill of others without respect. I had learned both. And they were learning it, too. The true turning point is realized when those who thought they controlled everything understand that control never existed. By now, the pattern was unmistakable. Mistakes that had been hidden in plain sight were no longer overlooked. Schedules slipped. Budgets strained. Responsibility shifted erratically. Every decision that once seemed effortless now carried weight. Weight they weren't prepared to bear. And the more they tried to stabilize, the more exposed their weaknesses became. I continued my life quietly. My own projects moved forward smoothly. I collaborated selectively. I shared only where value and respect were reciprocal. Every step I took reinforced something I had learned early on. Power without awareness is fragile. Respect without clarity is temporary. Trust without accountability is a liability. And those lessons were being learned by others, too late and without my interference. Then came the first direct acknowledgement. A message from someone who had orchestrated part of my removal. "We underestimated you. Everything feels unbalanced now." No excuses. No justifications. Just admission. Admitting reality is often harder than living it. And reality, now, was undeniable. I didn't reply. I had no reason to. The turning point isn't dramatic. It isn't explosive. It doesn't require confrontation. It arrives quietly, in evidence, in the rearrangement of what once seemed permanent. They didn't need me to act. Their own systems were doing it for me. Every misstep, every delayed response, every forgotten detail, these were the natural consequences of their choices. Weeks passed. By now, internal tension was constant. People questioned one another. Teams reorganized without clarity. Leaders scrambled for solutions, often conflicting with each other. They thought this was stress. It wasn't. It was the inevitability of imbalance. And balance, once disrupted, always seeks restoration. The full scope of their oversight became clear. I hadn't orchestrated this. I hadn't intervened. I had simply stepped aside. And by doing so, I revealed what they could not maintain on their own. This is the subtle power of patience. You don't need to act to win. You need only to allow systems, truth, and structure to respond naturally. Then came a quiet moment, the kind that feels monumental only in retrospect. I received another message. Everything you managed, no one else can hold it as effectively. Simple words. No apology. No request. Just truth. And truth doesn't need embellishment. I folded the message carefully. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just felt calm. Because turning points are never about triumph. They are about recognition. Recognition that patience, restraint, and clarity outweigh aggression, anger, and impulsive action. By the end of the quarter, the system had begun to correct itself. Leadership stabilized. Processes resumed. Accountability returned. All without me needing to intervene. The turning point was complete. The lesson was clear. Sometimes the most powerful action is to wait. Sometimes the most effective strategy is to step aside. Sometimes the best revenge is alignment. By the time I observed the outcomes, everything had begun to settle into place. No dramatic confrontations. No public humiliation. Just natural alignment. Projects that had faltered were being corrected. Budgets were stabilized. Teams were reorganized. And most importantly, responsibilities were matched with competence. Those who had once smiled at my quiet work now realized what happens when that work disappears. I wasn't involved in the corrections. I didn't need to be. Systems, once freed from manipulation and convenience, correct themselves. Processes, once neglected, begin to restore order. It was a slow, almost imperceptible justice. But it was absolute. I continued my own work elsewhere, consulting selectively, choosing projects where clarity and accountability mattered, choosing colleagues who valued substance over ego. The contrast was striking. What had been chaotic under my absence became orderly in my presence elsewhere. And what had been orderly under my presence became chaotic once I left. That contrast was not accidental. It was inevitable. People began to notice the difference. Not in announcements, not in fanfare, but in results. Performance reviews improved. Deadlines were finally met. Clients received accurate updates. All the small things I had maintained quietly were now missing, and the consequences of that absence had revealed their true value. I occasionally received messages, short, careful, acknowledging the shift. Things are different without you. We didn't realize how much depended on your oversight. Your absence highlighted what we failed to see. I didn't reply, because truth doesn't require acknowledgement. It only requires observation. Internal conflicts that had quietly grown began to surface. Small disagreements became obvious. Minor mistakes were traced. Team members who had relied on the facade of competence were suddenly exposed. I didn't instigate any of it. I simply observed the natural order of cause and effect. That's the essence of quiet resolution. You don't force consequences. You allow them to unfold. And they always do. One night, I returned to the storage unit. Not for documents. Not for proof. But to reflect. The files, the notes, the keys, all reminders of a past I had learned from, not a past I wanted to cling to. I understood something important. Resolution is internal before it is external. External outcomes matter less than internal clarity. When your mind and conscience are aligned, the world eventually follows. By now, those who had orchestrated my removal were no longer acting with certainty. They were cautious. They were attentive. They were aware that oversight alone could no longer protect them. Consequences had arrived quietly, through natural order, through procedural integrity. No accusations, no confrontation, just correction. And in correction, there is balance. I spent the following months focusing entirely on my work, my life, and my peace. No lingering resentment. No need for revenge. Only awareness. Because resolution isn't about punishing the past. It's about ensuring that systems, processes, and people eventually recognize reality. And reality, as I learned, doesn't require drama to assert itself.